He was the CEO of the bank, but when he tried to withdraw his own money, they treated him like he didn't exist. A cold, dismissive manager brushed him off, hiding behind flawed policies with no accountability. But the man they ignored had the power and the plan to turn the system upside down. What happened next shook the entire company, and justice hit harder than anyone expected. The morning fog still clung to the Brooklyn skyline as antique shop owner Chen Lu adjusted the blinds on his storefront window. To the average passerby, he was just another immigrant businessman, polite, reserved, a little mysterious. His shop was filled with carved statues, faded scrolls, and clocks that ticked a half-second too late. Nothing about it screamed danger. At exactly 9:04 a.m., the calm shattered. The door burst open with the force of men who had done this before. Two detectives, one tall with graying temples, the other broader, younger, eyes sharp like a wolf, stepped inside. Jack Crawford and Thomas Reed. Their badges caught the dim light, but they weren't here for conversation. "Chen Lu?" Crawford's voice echoed across the shelves of porcelain and brass. "Hands where I can see them." Before Chen could speak, Reed was already behind him, grabbing his wrists and pulling them back. No explanation, no warning. Just cold steel snapping shut. "Wait," Chen said, his voice calm but confused. "What's this about?" "Illegal activity, you know exactly what," Reed muttered, not meeting his eyes. Chen didn't struggle, he didn't argue, but his gaze sharpened. Beneath the surface of his collected expression, something shifted, like a switch. Outside, the small crowd gathering near the corner convenience store turned their heads as the detectives walked Chen to the unmarked car. Cameras in the shop, oddly, had stopped working an hour before the arrest. The security footage, always carefully backed up, had been wiped clean. No one questioned it. No one noticed. The report that followed painted a clear picture. Too clear. Anonymous tip, hidden documents, suspicious connections. The kind of narrative that looked good on paper, easy to believe at first glance. But something was off. There were no fingerprints on the files found in the back room. The handwriting didn't match Chen's. The witnesses never came forward. And yet, within hours, his name was on local news sites, framed as a key suspect in a growing case of immigration fraud. A foreign man, accused of manipulating a system too complex for most to understand. Viewers saw a mugshot, not the context, not the decades of quiet service, not the sealed files hidden deep in federal servers under a different name. What no one in that courtroom or even those two detectives knew was that Chen Lu had more clearance than the judge himself. But for now, he said nothing. He just watched and waited. Detective Jack Crawford sat in his car across the street from the courthouse, sipping lukewarm coffee from a stained paper cup. His eyes weren't on the traffic or the people. They were on the headlines. Every major outlet in the borough had picked up the same story. Chinese business owner tied to underground immigration ring. Police uncover hidden operation in Brooklyn antique store. It was working. The narrative had taken root. Inside the precinct, the air buzzed with false congratulations. High fives and hushed tones. Files signed faster than they should have been. Nobody asked why the security footage was corrupted. Nobody questioned how the documents had appeared so conveniently. It was just another arrest, another statistic to throw into the system. But beneath that polished surface, there was a different game being played. One driven by fear and greed. For years, Crawford and his partner Thomas Reed had operated in the gray zone. They knew the system well enough to bend it. They knew which judges preferred silence over mess and which clerks to avoid because they asked too many questions. What they didn't know, couldn't have imagined, was that the man they'd just brought in wasn't what he seemed. To them, Chen Lu was a quiet outsider with no support network, no media presence, no family in the States. Easy to isolate, easy to blame. And if someone from higher up eventually noticed the inconsistencies, they could quietly drop the charges and move on. No accountability, no exposure, just silence. That was the plan. Back in his holding cell, Chen sat still, not afraid, just calculating. The walls were thin, the fluorescent light above flickered slightly, too high to reach, but not unnoticed. He'd spent enough time in rooms like this across oceans and time zones to know exactly how they were built. More importantly, he understood how they could be unbuilt. The paperwork charging him was already circulating through internal systems. It was a checklist of assumptions. Forged ledgers found behind a bookshelf, alleged cash deposits from foreign accounts, names of clients who didn't exist, all tied together in a way that sounded just plausible enough to stick. But one detail gave him pause. The pen used to write the ledger entries was a brand discontinued 3 years ago, only stocked now by specific federal departments. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Someone inside wanted this to look like an amateur job, wanted it to fall apart under real scrutiny. But that meant something even more dangerous. Not everyone on the inside was aligned. Meanwhile, Reed was growing uneasy. The younger detective, always quick to act, had started noticing the cracks. His hands trembled slightly as he filed the new evidence into the system. He didn't say it aloud, but part of him wondered, what if we got the wrong guy? What if this man wasn't just innocent, but someone we weren't supposed to touch? But Crawford kept him in line. Trust the system, Crawford said flatly. It'll wash it all away. Yet for Chen Lu, it was already too late to just let it go. He'd been sent to expose corruption. Now, he was living proof of how deep it ran. And the deeper he watched them dig, the more certain he became. They were about to fall into their own trap. 3 days had passed since Chen Lu's arrest. Public opinion had shifted swiftly. Local news anchors recited the same lines from the official statement, while talk radio filled airtime with speculation. Foreign national backroom dealings. National threat. It was a crafted image. One Chen knew had been designed not just to convince the public, but to isolate him from any possible sympathy. But they'd miscalculated. Severely. Far from a man left to fend for himself, Chen was quietly triggering a different kind of response. One that operated behind sealed walls and encrypted channels. In a secure facility just outside Washington, D.C., Agent Carla James stared at her screen in disbelief. A red-coded alert had pinged her terminal. Embedded asset status. Compromised. She didn't need to scroll far to see the name. Lu Chen. Active ID, U.S. Intelligence Field Liaison, priority level, Tier 3. Chen wasn't just another contact. He had personally worked with her office on 3 separate operations involving transnational trafficking networks. His role had always been shadowed, precise, and quiet. And now he was plastered across every screen in New York as if he were a petty criminal. Carla picked up the phone. Her voice was low and controlled. Initiate internal trace. I want access to the arrest logs, officer reports, digital evidence logs, everything. Within the hour, the inconsistencies poured in. The original arrest warrant, no signature from a federal judge. The video surveillance failure, traced to a manual override at 8:51 a.m., logged from an IP address registered under a personal device belonging to Detective Thomas Reed's wife. The ledger evidence, ink density matched a printer model used exclusively in the precinct's third-floor evidence room, not Chen's shop. These weren't small mistakes. They were the type of flaws that only looked invisible to people who had never expected someone would check. And Chen was counting on exactly that. Inside his holding cell, he began step 2. He requested a meeting with his court-appointed attorney, not for legal advice, but to deliver a message. It wasn't a code or threat. It was a name. One word, handwritten on a small corner of a legal pad. Sandpiper. That was all Carla needed. Sandpiper was the name of a dormant protocol, a private intelligence failsafe used only when an embedded asset was at risk from domestic threats. With it came a single function, exposure. Files began surfacing in digital back channels, internal memos, wire transfers, a voice recording, clipped but clear, where Crawford casually discussed getting ahead of a potential mole inside our own team. It was subtle, but damning, and it placed a target squarely on Chen's frame-up as deliberate. But Crawford wasn't sitting still either. The detective had his own sources and started noticing strange shifts, requests for his personnel file, data audits on his badge usage, silence from his usual contacts in the department. Something was shifting beneath him. Reed noticed too, though he said nothing. He'd begun losing sleep, plagued by doubt. The nervous energy that had once driven him was turning inward. Crawford, however, doubled down. He called a private meeting with a contact at the district attorney's office, pushing for a fast-tracked indictment. "Wrap this up quick," he insisted, "before outside eyes get involved." But it was already too late. From a single word passed through legal paper, a chain had begun, and it was moving faster than they could contain. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning, not in temperature, but in silence. Reporters lined the back wall. Court officers stood more alert than usual. The judge, a seasoned woman named Marilyn Fisher, reviewed her case docket with narrowed eyes. She had overseen hundreds of hearings, but something about today felt staged, tense, off rhythm. Chen Lu sat calmly at the defendant's table. He wore a simple gray suit, the same one he'd worn during an international peace conference in Geneva 2 years ago, though no one in the room knew that. His expression was neutral, not stoic, not afraid, just focused. The prosecution began its opening argument. Assistant District Attorney Leonard Brooks was confident, too confident. He presented the case with polish, the alleged evidence, the anonymous tip, the suspicious deposits. He referred to Chen as the operator, a term meant to distance the man from the humanity behind his face. But every detail was recited like it had been memorized, not lived. Then it was the defense's turn. Chen's lawyer, Michael Trent, stood slowly. His suit was less crisp than Brooks's, and his tone was quieter, but there was weight in his pause. "Your Honor," he began, "before we proceed with witness statements, the defense has received new information from federal authorities, and we request it be entered into the record immediately." A quiet murmur swept the courtroom. Judge Fisher frowned. "On what grounds?" Trent replied calmly. "On the grounds that continuing without it would mean this court proceeds under false pretenses. And because the contents directly affect the legitimacy of the charges." He handed over a sealed folder. Judge Fisher opened it. Inside, a set of classified documents, redacted, but only lightly. Enough to show Chen's operative status. Enough to reveal direct communication logs between him and a federal liaison. Alongside them, metadata proving the files used to charge him were planted, access logs from precinct terminals, and a transcription of a voice recording. Fisher pressed play. Crawford's voice filled the room. Clear, unmistakable. "If this guy really is who I think he is, we need to shut him down now, before it gets traced back to us." Silence. Then a second voice. Reed's. "I don't know, Jack. What if this blows back?" A pause. Then Crawford again, lower. "Then we bury him before that happens." The audio cut. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Brooks, the prosecutor, looked stunned. Not because of what was revealed, but because he hadn't known. His entire case had just collapsed in front of him, and he was realizing in real time that he had been used. Judge Fisher leaned back slowly. She looked first at the defense, then at the stunned prosecution, and finally at Chen. "Mr. Lu," she said, her voice low but clear, "I believe you've waited long enough." She turned to the bailiff. "Have Detectives Crawford and Reed escorted into custody for questioning, effective immediately." The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in whispers, gasps, stunned realization. For the first time, the media saw the truth, not in sound bites or headlines, but with their own eyes. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but the story was already writing itself. Crawford and Reed were let out within the hour. The case against Chen was dismissed in full. But more than that, a formal apology was read aloud on record. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a message. For the first time in weeks, Chen allowed himself a breath of quiet relief. He hadn't just defended himself, he had exposed something far greater, and it had unfolded right in front of the very system that tried to erase him. Weeks passed, the headlines changed. The same outlets that once framed Chen Lu as a foreign threat now praised him as a man of resilience, the agent who turned a courtroom into a spotlight. News segments debated the implications of his case. Interviews with legal analysts, former intelligence officers, even whistleblowers began to surface. Something had cracked open, but Chen didn't appear on talk shows. He didn't hold press conferences. He never commented on the case again. Instead, he returned to the same neighborhood where everything began. The antique shop was closed permanently. In its place, a modest community office opened with no sign out front, just a frosted window and a quiet bell over the door. Inside, young volunteers worked at folding desks, answering calls from people who didn't know where else to go. Small business owners under investigation, families confused by legal letters, individuals too afraid to ask for help. Chen never introduced himself by his old name. He simply asked people what they needed and listened. Behind the scenes, reforms began. Internal reviews were launched into precinct practices. A state-level inquiry into prosecutorial oversight was announced. Quietly, a federal commendation was signed in Chen's name, not for the public, but for the record. He never sought revenge. He sought balance. Because Chen understood something most people missed. Some victories aren't loud. Some wars end not with a final strike, but with the choice to rebuild. Better, quieter, and stronger than before. And in that quiet space, he found what the courtroom never promised him: peace.